A nurse slapped a 94-year-old Marine, but she never saw the 15 hardened bikers watching. Now, a son's rage is about to be unleashed, forcing him to choose between the law he flouts and the brutal justice his family demands. If you're new here, subscribe and comment your location. Now, let's begin. The air in Paul Marino's room at the Oak Creek retirement home was thick, a cloying mix of antiseptic, steamed vegetables, and the faint, lingering scent of 15 men who lived on the road. It was a smell Daniel "Bull" Marino usually associated with freedom, with brotherhood. But here, trapped between these sterile walls, it felt like a cage. He forced a wide grin, the one he used to charm bartenders and intimidate rivals, and leaned over his father's bed, his massive frame blocking the fluorescent light. "Come on, Pops. You gotta eat more than that. The Jell-O's the good green one, not the crap red kind." He wiggled the spoon, making the lime green cube tremble. Paul Marino, 94 years old, a man whose spine had once been straight enough to lead a platoon onto the hellish black sands of Iwo Jima, was now a fragile collection of bones under a thin blanket. But his eyes, a piercing clear blue that saw everything, flickered with life. They swept the room, taking in his sons, all of them, 15 members of the Iron Souls MC, clad in worn leather vests adorned with their Reaper insignia, crowded the small space. They were men with names like Jaws, Tiny, and Gears, men who collected debts and enforced boundaries. But in this room, they were just Paul's boys. They brought the outside in with them, the scent of motor oil, cheap whiskey, and open highways, a weekly infusion of life that fought back against the slow, creeping decay. "The red has more flavor," Paul rasped, a ghost of his old commanding voice. A tremor ran through his hand as he pointed a bony finger. "You wouldn't know flavor if it hit you in the face, Danny." A ripple of genuine warm laughter went through the men. Bull, the club's vice president, felt a real smile break through his performative one. "See? He's still sharper than all you clowns combined. Still putting me in my place." The moment was perfect. A tiny, defiant pocket of warmth in a cold world. It was a sanctuary, and for a few minutes, the weight of Bull's other life, the violence, the money, the constant low-grade threat, lifted from his shoulders. It was shattered by the sharp, imperious click of heels on linoleum. "All right. Gentlemen, visiting hours are technically over. Mr. Marino needs his rest." The voice was like saccharine, sweet, but with a bitter, chemical aftertaste. Nurse Brenda swept into the room, a woman whose tight, blonde bun and tighter smile seemed designed to suppress any form of joy. Her eyes, a flat, lifeless brown, scanned the room of bikers with a familiar blend of disdain and a flicker of fear. Bull felt the mood shift instantly. The relaxed postures of his brothers straightened. The easy laughter died in their throats. "We just got here, sweetheart," Bull said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. He kept his tone even, the one he used when dealing with cops or nosy city councilmen, a veneer of civility over a core of steel. "Give us 10 more minutes. The man needs his family, not just his rest." "It's not a request, Mr. Marino. It's policy." She moved past him as if he weren't there, her focus laser-locked on Paul. She carried a small paper cup with a single, large white pill in it. "Now, Paul, let's get you settled. You need to take your new medication." Paul's face, which had been animated moments before, crumpled with confusion and a touch of fear. I don't need that one, Danny. Makes my head fuzzy. I can't think straight. I don't like it." "Doctor's orders," Brenda said, her voice losing its fake sweetness, turning hard and transactional. She reached for his arm, her grip firm and impersonal. Bull stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. His 6'4" frame seemed to suck all the air and space from the corner. "He said he doesn't want it." The words were clipped, final. "You heard him." She ignored Bull completely, a calculated dismissal that sent a fresh wave of heat up his neck. She was treating his father like a disobedient child, like an object. "Don't be difficult, Paul. Open up." She brought the pill to his lips, her fingers pinching it. What happened next unfolded in a horrifying, slow-motion blur that would be seared into Bull's memory forever. Paul, frustrated, embarrassed, and scared, swatted at her hand. It was a weak, uncoordinated gesture, the last resort of a man who had spent a lifetime commanding respect. The pill flew from her fingers, a tiny white arc, and landed silently on the patterned floor. A look of pure, unadulterated rage contorted Brenda's face. It was there and gone in a second, a flash of lightning that revealed the true landscape of her soul. But every single man in the room saw it. They were experts in reading aggression, in sensing the shift before a fight. And this was a seismic shift. "You stupid old man!" She hissed, the words venomous. And then she did it. Smack. The sound was like a gunshot in the hushed room, an open-handed, stinging slap across Paul Marino's face. His head snapped to the side with a force that seemed like it would break his neck. A faint, hand-shaped red mark began to bloom on his papery, age-spotted skin. The world stopped. For a full 3 seconds, there was absolute dead silence. The 15 members of the Iron Souls MC froze, their brains wired for instant, violent response, struggling to process the unimaginable. Someone had laid a hand on their pops, not in a dark alley, not in a rival bar, but here, in his own bed, in front of all of them. The violation was so profound, it was momentarily paralyzing. Bull didn't remember moving. There was no thought, only a primal white-hot circuitry that bypassed his brain and went straight to his muscles. One moment he was standing by the bed. The next he had Brenda slammed against the wall, his left forearm pressed like an iron bar against her throat, cutting off her air. His right hand was fisted in the front of her scrubs, the fabric tearing. His face was inches from hers. His eyes, usually a calm, watchful brown, were now black pits of murderous intent. The spell was broken for the others. As one, they closed ranks, a wall of leather and muscle. James, the sergeant-at-arms, blocked the door, his massive arms crossed. David, the treasurer, stood at the window, his sharp eyes scanning the parking lot. The room, which had moments ago been filled with love, was now a sealed chamber of imminent violence. The air crackled with it, a static charge that raised the hairs on their arms. "You," Bull whispered, his voice trembling with a fury so deep and personal it was terrifying. It wasn't the cold fury of business. This was a raw, wounded, paternal rage. "What did you just do?" Brenda's eyes bulged. Her face, which had been twisted in anger, was now a mask of pure, pants-wetting terror. She clawed at his arm, her nails scratching uselessly at his leather vest. She tried to speak, but only a choked gurgle escaped her lips. The scent of her fear, sharp and sour, mixed with the antiseptic air. "Bull!" The voice was weak, thready, but it carried an undeniable authority. It was Paul. He had pushed himself up straighter in the bed, his hand reaching out, trembling, to rest on his son's arm. "Daniel, not here, not like this." The sound of his real name, the one only his father used, was a bucket of ice water thrown on the inferno in his soul. Bull's vision, which had narrowed to a red tunnel focused on Brenda's terrified face, cleared slightly. He could feel the expectant energy of his brothers behind him, a coiled spring waiting for his signal. A single nod, a grunted word, and Nurse Brenda would be reduced to a problem permanently solved. But Pops was right. Not here, not in his sanctuary, not in front of him. He leaned in closer, his lips almost brushing her ear, his voice dropping to a lethal guttural whisper meant only for her. "You have no idea what you just started. You're going to walk out of this room. You're going to clock out. And you're going to go home. And you are going to pray. Sweetheart, you pray that we find you before the cops do, because what they'll do to you is nothing, nothing, compared to what we will." He released her. She didn't stand. She slumped to the floor, a boneless heap clutching her throat, great ragged sobs racking her body. She was a pitiful sight, but no one in the room felt an ounce of pity. Mark, a young prospect eager to prove his worth, opened the door just enough for her to scramble out on her hands and knees like a crab, the frantic, skittering sound of her flight echoing down the sterile hallway. The door clicked shut. The room was silent again, but now it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. The violence had been averted, but it hadn't dissipated. It had just been postponed, banked like a fire, hotter and more dangerous for being contained. Bull turned back to his father. His massive hands, which moments before had been instruments of death, were now shaking. He knelt by the bed, his knees cracking against the hard floor, and gently, so gently, cupped the old man's face. His thumb, rough and calloused, brushed over the red mark, a tender gesture that was a stark contrast to the scene that had just unfolded. "Pops, I'm so sorry." Bull's voice broke. The vice president was gone, replaced by a guilty, heartbroken son. "I'm so sorry I let that happen. I should have—" Paul's eyes were filled with tears, not from the physical pain, but from a profound, gut-wrenching shame. The shame of being helpless, of being humiliated in front of his sons. It's not the first time she's been rough," he whispered, his voice thick. "She's been taking things. My watch, the money you gave me for the canteen. I tried to tell the other nurse, the nice one, Stella, but she said I was confused, that old people get confused." A new, colder kind of anger began to mix with the hot, blinding rage in Bull's gut. This wasn't just an isolated moment of cruelty from a stressed-out caregiver. This was a pattern. This was predation. This was a disease. And Brenda was just a symptom. Bull stood up. The grief and guilt on his face solidified into something hard, impenetrable, and deadly calm. He turned to his brothers. The look in his eyes was one they all recognized. It was the look that preceded a war. "James," Bull said, his voice now flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a strategist planning a siege. "Yeah, Bull." James already had his phone in his hand. "Get on the phone. I want a car on her. I want to know where she lives, who she sees, what she eats for fucking breakfast. I want her whole life, every dirty little secret, on my desk by morning. Don't lose her." James simply nodded, his thumbs already flying across his screen, his voice a low growl as he started issuing commands to the prospects waiting outside. "David," Bull continued, turning to the club's treasurer. David was the brains, the man who could launder money through 3 shell companies before lunch. He was sharp, meticulous, and utterly ruthless with numbers. "I'm on it," David said, adjusting his glasses. "I'll pull the records. His financials from the home, his medication logs, everything. If she's stealing from him, she's stealing from others. It's a business. We'll find the ledger." Bull looked at his father, who seemed to have shrunk even further into the bed. He placed a firm, steadying hand on his shoulder. "I promise you, Pops, on my life, on my cut, no one touches our family. No one. This ends tonight." The clubhouse, a converted auto body shop on the industrial edge of the city, was a storm of controlled chaos. The news had traveled through the grapevine faster than a Harley on an open highway, and the air was thick with the smell of beer, cigar smoke, and the palpable promise of retribution. Young prospects moved with a new urgency, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The old heads, the veterans with knuckles scarred from 100 fights, sat with a grim, knowing stillness. They knew what was coming. But in the chapel, the club's soundproofed meeting room, Bull sat with his inner circle, forcing a level head. The table was scarred with cigarette burns and ringed with the ghosts of 1,000 difficult decisions. "We can't just whack her," David said, spreading a fan of printouts across the scarred oak. "It's too clean, it draws heat, and it doesn't solve the problem. And look at this." He tapped a column of numbers. "Paul's monthly incidentals and personal care fee has tripled in the last 3 months, and he's not the only one. I cross-referenced the other patients on his wing. 4 others have had similar spikes. And the medication logs." He shook his head in disgust. "He's being charged for insulin twice a day. Bull, your father isn't diabetic. He hasn't been for his whole life." James grunted, cracking his knuckles. The sound was like popping rocks. "It's a racket. She's not working alone. That whole fucking home is a hunting ground. They're preying on the ones who can't fight back." Bull stared at a faded black and white photo he kept on the chapel wall. It showed a young Paul Marino, standing tall and proud in his Marine uniform, his eyes clear and fearless. A man who had faced down Imperial Japanese soldiers was now being slapped and stolen from by a woman in scrubs. The injustice was a physical acid in his veins. "So we don't just take out the soldier," Bull said, his voice low and dangerous. "We burn the whole fort down. We salt the earth so nothing like this can ever grow there again." He looked up, his gaze sweeping over James, David, and the other 2 officers. "But we do it smart. We're not animals. We're businessmen. We expose them. We ruin them. We take everything from them, just like they were taking from Pops." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "And then," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we visit them." The plan was set in motion with the chilling efficiency of a military operation. Over the next few days, the Iron Souls operated on two parallel tracks. The first was a facade of legitimate inquiry. Prospects, who usually looked like they'd just rolled out of a bar fight, were scrubbed clean and dressed in borrowed button-down shirts. They posed as concerned nephews and grandsons visiting Oak Creek to ask careful, pointed questions about fee structures, medication management, and patient safety. They were polite, respectful, and their eyes missed nothing. The second track was in the shadows. David, with the help of a paranoid genius hacker they kept on a generous retainer, delved deep into the nursing home's corporate ownership, a labyrinth of LLCs and holding companies. They followed the money, tracing it from the inflated patient bills to the shell companies and finally to a series of offshore accounts. It was during this tense, shadow war investigation that Elena came into the picture. She was the day shift nurse who had earned Paul's trust. Bull first saw her properly 2 days after the incident. He'd come for an unannounced visit, his gut churning with a need to see his father, to assure himself the world was still right. He found her at Paul's bedside, her back to the door. She was leaning over, patiently helping him with a crossword puzzle book, her voice a soft, melodic counterpoint to the grim reality of the place. "He's stuck on a 7-letter word for courage," she said, looking up as Bull's shadow fell over them. She didn't startle. Her eyes, a warm, deep brown, met his without flinching. She had a calm, centered presence that was immediately disarming. "Valor," Bull said, the word coming out softer than he'd intended. He was caught off guard by her directness, by the lack of fear in her gaze. Paul smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "See, my boy is smart. He reads." Elena smiled back, a transformation that lit up her whole face, and for a single dizzying moment, the crushing weight on Bull's shoulders felt a little lighter. "That's it, Valor." She stood smoothing down her blue scrubs. "I'll let you two talk. He's had a good day today, much more like himself." Bull caught up with her just outside the room, in the hallway that smelled of bleach and despair. "Thank you," he said, his voice gruff, "for being kind to him." Elena's gaze was direct, assessing. "He's a lovely man. It's an honor to care for him." She hesitated, glancing down the hall to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice. "He told me what happened with Brenda. I reported it to the administration, filed a formal incident report, but nothing's happened. She's still on the schedule, just moved to a different wing. It's like they're protecting her." Bull's jaw tightened, a muscle twitched under his eye. "Of course they are." "There are other rumors," Elena continued, her voice barely a whisper. She was risking her job, he realized. "About missing items, jewelry, cash, about bills that don't make sense. I've tried to speak up in staff meetings, but I'm new. They just tell me I'm stressing the system and that I need to learn how things are done here." The frustration in her voice was raw and genuine. It was the sound of a good person trapped in a corrupt machine. A dangerous, brilliant idea began to form in the strategic part of Bull's mind. An inside ally, a source, someone who knew the system, who had access, who was trusted. He looked at her, her intelligence, her compassion, her clear moral courage. "What's your name?" he asked, though he already knew it from her name tag. He wanted to hear her say it. "Elena. Elena Reyes." "Elena," Bull said, his tone deadly serious. He took a half step closer, invading her personal space, not as a threat, but as a conspirator. "What if you could really do something? What if you could help us stop it? Not just report it, stop it. For good." Her eyes widened slightly, the brown depths searching his. She was smart. She understood the implication immediately. "Us?" He didn't answer. He just held her gaze, letting her look into the abyss of his world, letting her see the promise of ruthless, effective justice there. The charged silence between them was as palpable as the tension before a thunderstorm. She was standing at a precipice, and he was asking her to jump. She took a deep breath, her decision made in that single courageous moment. "I want to help Paul," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Their alliance became the linchpin of the entire operation. Their meetings were clandestine, fraught with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with the two of them. They met in quiet, anonymous coffee shops where the steam from their cups fogged the windows, or during her lunch breaks in a deserted city park, sitting on a bench while the world passed by, oblivious. They were a study in contrasts, the hulking, tattooed biker, his knuckles scarred, his presence a disruption to the peaceful surroundings, and the compassionate, graceful nurse, her demeanor calm and healing. But as they shared information, her insider knowledge of staff routines and medication cart security, his findings from David's digital sleuthing, a powerful, undeniable chemistry ignited. It was in the way their hands brushed when she passed him a folded copy of a medication log, the electric jolt that passed between them. It was in the way her laughter, a sudden, warm, surprised sound, escaped her at one of his dry, gallows humor jokes. It was in the way his protective instincts, usually so brutal and encompassing, became fiercely, exclusively gentle when focused on her. During one late-night meeting at the clubhouse, after she'd provided a crucial printout of the controlled substance logs that showed massive discrepancies, Bull walked her to her car. The club's parking lot was quiet, illuminated by a single flickering floodlight that cast long, dancing shadows. The roar of the party inside was a distant, muffled beat. "You're taking a big risk," he said, standing close to her beside her sensible, compact car. The night air was cool, but the space between them was warm. "You know what we are, what we do." She looked up at him, the poor light carving the elegant lines of her face into a beautiful mask. "I know what you are to Paul. I see the way he looks at you. And I know what you're trying to do for him, for all of them in that place. That's what matters to me. That's the only thing that matters." He reached out then, his calloused fingers capable of such violence, coming up to gently trace the line of her jaw. It was the lightest of touches, a whisper of skin on skin, but it sent a jolt through both of them, a current of pure, unvarnished want. Her breath hitched. He could feel the rapid, fluttering pulse at the base of her throat. "When this is over," he started, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, full of a promise he couldn't yet put into words. "When this is over," she finished for him, her own voice breathless, her eyes holding his with a certainty that stole the air from his lungs. It was a pact, a future. He watched her taillights disappear into the night, the ghost of her touch still burning on his skin like a brand. The final pieces fell into place with a sickening, inevitable clarity. David's hacker, a ghost in the machine, uncovered a shell company named Aegis Patient Services that was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from patient trust accounts. The paper trail, carefully obfuscated, led directly to the nursing home's administrator, a slick, silver-haired fox named Mr. Harrington, and his head of security, a corrupt ex-cop named Russo, a hulking brute whose reputation for brutality had followed him off the force. Brenda was just their frontline operative, the petty cashier in a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. James's physical surveillance confirmed it. From a van with tinted windows, he watched Brenda meet Russo in the shadowy corner of a supermarket parking lot. An envelope thick with cash changed hands. They were partners. They were all partners in this grift against the helpless. They had it all. Bank records, secretly recorded conversations from a tiny device Elena had planted in the staff room, damning time-stamped photos. It was a prosecutor's dream. It was enough to send them all away for a long, long time. But for the iron souls, the law was only half the justice. The law was slow, and it was lenient. It allowed for plea deals and early parole. Their justice was swift, final, and carried a much deeper lesson. The takedown was a two-pronged attack, a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. An anonymous, meticulously organized packet of evidence was delivered simultaneously to the district attorney's office, the state licensing board, and a notoriously dogged local investigative journalist. At the exact same time, under the cover of a moonless night, Bull, James, and David paid a visit to the administrator's expensive mock Tudor home in a pristine suburb, where the streets were silent and the lawns were perfect. Harrington answered the door himself, dressed in a silk robe, a crystal glass of brandy in his hand. His face, usually a mask of unflappable confidence, paled to the color of old parchment when he saw the three grim-faced men looking utterly out of place on his manicured doorstep. "We're here to accept your resignation," Bull said calmly, stepping inside without an invitation. His boots were loud on the polished marble floor. "Effective immediately. You're going to call your board in the morning and cite personal reasons. You're going to liquidate your assets, the offshore ones too, to reimburse every single patient you and your people have stolen from, with a 50% interest penalty for the inconvenience. And then you're going to get in your car, drive to the airport, and leave this state. Permanently." Harrington sputtered, his dignity affronted. "You can't. This is extortion. I'll call the police." James stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence filling the opulent foyer, his silence more threatening than any shout. He picked up a small, expensive-looking porcelain figurine from a side table, examined it with a dispassionate eye, and then, without changing expression, crushed it to dust in his hand. The fine powder sifted through his fingers onto the pristine floor. "No," James rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "This is a courtesy. The alternative involves a lot more cement, a very deep lake, and no one ever finding your brandy glass again. Your choice." The man crumpled. The fight went out of him in a rush, his shoulders slumping. He looked from Bull's cold, determined eyes to James's implacable face, to David's sharp, calculating gaze. He knew with a chilling certainty that he was looking at men who operated on a different, older set of rules, a code where consequences were absolute and permanent. He nodded, defeated. Next was Russo, the security chief. They found him in his usual dive bar, a place called The Last Call, holding court with a few sycophants playing the big man. Bull sat down on the stool next to him. The bar smelled of stale beer and desperation. "The cops are on their way, Russo," Bull said quietly, not looking at him. "They have everything. The shell company, the transfers, the photos of you and Brenda. They'll be here in about 10 minutes. Russo, a proud and violently stupid man, sneered. "You got nothing." "But we wanted to thank you personally," Bull continued, as if he hadn't spoken, finally turning to look at him, "for the exceptional care you showed our father." That was the trigger. Russo, his ego fatally wounded, made the mistake of swinging first. He was big, and he was fast, but he was a brawler. Bull, James, and David were artists of violence. The ensuing fight was short, brutal, and entirely one-sided. It was less a fight and more a dismantling. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, responding to the anonymous tip about the massive embezzlement ring at Oak Creek, they found Russo unconscious, slumped over the sticky bar, his face a bloody mess, one arm bent at a sickening angle. A neatly bound folder of evidence was sitting on the bar stool beside him. Finally, it was Brenda's turn. She had been hiding in a cheap, pay-by-the-week motel on the edge of town, too terrified to go home, living on vending machine snacks and her own fear. She never heard them come in. James had a master key for every seedy motel in the city. One moment she was staring at a flickering game show on the ancient TV. The next, the door was open and the small, dank room was filled with silent, leather-clad men, blocking her only exit. Bull stood in front of her, his expression unreadable. She began to sob hysterically, begging, offering excuses, snot and tears mingling on her face. "Please, I was just following orders. Harrington and Russo, they made me do it. I have kids. I have 2 little boys." "So did the men my father fought against in the Pacific," Bull said, his voice cold and flat, devoid of all mercy. "It didn't make them right. It didn't make their actions any less monstrous." He tossed a one-way plane ticket onto the stained bedspread. "You have one chance. One. You get on that plane to a city you've never heard of. You get a job. A real job, not this. You keep your head down and you never ever work near the elderly, the sick, or the vulnerable again. If your name ever pops up on a nursing license, a caregiver application, anything, anywhere in this country, we will know." He leaned down, his face close to hers, his final words dropping into the room like stones into a deep well. "And our visit will not be as diplomatic." She stared at the ticket, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. Then she looked back at him, and in her eyes he saw the understanding dawn. This was a mercy of sorts, an exile. It was a mercy Paul Marino had insisted on. A life for a slap is not balanced, son. He told Bull, his hand on his son's arm. You break her. You scare her so straight she never even thinks of looking sideways again. But you don't end her. That's not who we are. They left her there, sobbing with a messy, complicated relief and terror. Her life as she knew it over. She was a ghost already. A week later, Bull stood with his father in the sunny, well-tended gardens of a new, well-vetted assisted living facility. It was funded by a sudden, mysterious, and generous charitable donation from an anonymous benefactor. The sun was warm on their faces. Paul was in his wheelchair, a soft blanket over his lap, but he was sitting straighter. The haunted, shamed look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a familiar, quiet peace. The paper said it was a whistleblower, Paul said, a knowing, almost mischievous glint in his blue eyes. He pointed a trembling finger at the newspaper on his lap. Said the administrator fled the state for personal reasons, and the security chief confessed to everything after a bar fight went wrong. Quite a coincidence. Isn't that something? Bull said, a real, easy smile spreading across his face for the first time in weeks. The world works in mysterious ways. Paul reached out and gripped his son's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. You did good, Danny. You kept your head. You protected your family without losing your soul in the process. You used your power, but you didn't let it consume you. That, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That is all a father can ever ask for. Later that evening, the Iron Souls threw a massive party at the clubhouse. It wasn't just a party, it was a catharsis. The roar of laughter, classic rock, and clinking bottles was a joyous, defiant release of weeks of pent-up tension and rage. The club was whole. Their honor was satisfied. Their family was safe. Bull stood on the periphery of the chaos, a cold beer in his hand, watching his family. His gaze, as it so often did now, found Elena. She was there, talking with Jennifer, James's old lady, by the pool table. She was laughing at something Jennifer said, and the sound, even across the noisy room, felt like a balm to his soul. She felt his look and met it, and a slow, beautiful, intimate smile spread across her face, meant only for him. He made his way through the crowd to her. Men clapped him on the back. Prospects nodded with deep respect, but his focus was solely on her. The music was deafening, but between them the world had gone quiet. I owe you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We all do. We couldn't have done it without you. You don't owe me anything, she replied, her eyes shining. Seeing Paul safe, seeing him happy and treated with respect, that is all the thanks I will ever need. He took her hand, lacing his rough, scarred fingers with her smooth, delicate ones. It felt more right than anything ever had. Stay, he said, the single word loaded with the weight of every unspoken promise, every charged glance, every breathless moment they had shared. Stay with me tonight. Her answer was in her eyes, in the way her fingers tightened around his, in the way she leaned into his body, trusting and sure. He led her away from the noise, his hand a possessive, guiding pressure on the small of her back, up the narrow private staircase to his rooms above the clubhouse. The moment the heavy door closed behind them, the world outside, the music, the brotherhood, the violence, the business, ceased to exist. He backed her against the door, his hands coming up to cradle her face, his thumbs stroking the high arches of her cheekbones. Elena, he murmured, her name a prayer, a confession, a vow on his lips. That was all he could say before her lips found his. The kiss was not gentle. It was weeks of suppressed tension, of fear, of a desperate blooming hope, all exploding at once. It was heat and need and a shocking, profound tenderness that threatened to undo him. His hands roamed her body, learning its curves through the thin fabric of her dress, pulling her flush against him as if he could fuse them together into a single safe entity. Her fingers tangled in his long hair, pulling him closer, her soft, eager moans a symphony in the quiet room. They stumbled towards the large, unmade bed, a tangle of limbs and discarded clothing, leaving a trail of his leather vest, her dress, his boots. There, in the dim light filtering through the single window, the fearsome vice president of the Iron Souls was just a man, vulnerable and yearning. And the brave nurse was just a woman, powerful in her surrender. He worshipped her body with a reverence that left her breathless. His touch both possessive and adoring, as if he were memorizing her. She, in turn, mapped the landscape of his scars with her lips and tongue, the knife wound on his ribs, the bullet graze on his shoulder, the burn on his forearm, each one a story of a life lived on the edge, and she accepted all of it, kissed each one as if she could heal the past. When he finally entered her, it was with a slow, deliberate intensity that made her cry out his name, her nails digging into the hard, corded muscles of his back. It was a claiming, a surrender, a homecoming. It was raw and passionate and emotionally shattering. He moved within her like a man finally finding his anchor, and she rose to meet him like a wave meeting the shore. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of his violent world, they created something entirely new. Something fragile and beautiful and fiercely, ferociously protected. The climax was a silent, shuddering cataclysm that left them both breathless and clinging to each other in the aftermath, their hearts hammering a frantic, synchronized rhythm against each other's chests. Later, as they lay tangled in the sweat-slicked sheets, her head pillowed on his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, she traced the club's Reaper insignia tattooed over his ribs. "So what happens now?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice soft and sleepy. He held her tighter, his arms a solid, secure band around her, and dropped a kiss into her hair, breathing in her scent, soap, sunshine, and now, him. "Now," he said, his voice full of a certainty and peace he hadn't felt since he was a boy, safe in his father's house. "We live." Downstairs, the party raged on, the sound a testament to a family preserved, an honor defended, an empire that stood unshaken. But upstairs, in the quiet dark, a new story was just beginning. The score was settled, the balance was restored, and for the first time in a long, long time, Daniel Bull Marino had someone to fight for, beyond the club, beyond the code, beyond the violence. He had a future, and he would protect it with everything he had. Thank you for watching. This story proves that some lines should never be crossed. But what would you have done if you were in that room? Would you have sought revenge or called the police? Subscribe and let us know your city in the comments. We read every single one.